Hello everyone and welcome back to the Plutonium Show. You know what the agenda is today. I can't believe that I can only film one day a week, being the Sunday, because as I mentioned, construction every other day and I'm flat out Monday to Friday. So when I heard the news, which I completely did not expect, that the former Prince Andrew, Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, was arrested, I could not wait to get into this, to film, to sink my teeth into it, and here we are. So that's what we're going to be sinking our teeth into today, in addition to some commentary, of course, from Prince Harry, specifically Prince Harry, I think, in this instance. And finally, we're closing off with an update on the ongoing trial of Marius borg høiby. It looks like he is really starting to lose it. Not since the 17th century has a member of the British royal family been arrested. And certainly never before has this happened in the monarchy's modern history. I was actually preparing an entirely different podcast for today before the news on Thursday of Andrew's arrest hit. Just to illustrate how much I did not expect this to happen, the episode was going to be about how Edward, the Duke of Windsor, despite all the allegations against him in terms of being a Nazi sympathizer at best, and an actual spy, a traitor at worst, was never held to account. He was never made to face the consequences. People around him who were not royals or ex-kings were tried and executed while he and Wallace lived out the rest of their lives in luxury in Europe. And so I was going to draw a parallel there of, it looks like this is likely going to happen again. We're seeing other non-royal individuals such as Peter Mandelson getting investigated, potentially talks of an arrest, etc., etc. And I was thinking, this is history yet again repeating itself. The non-royals are going to get it while the royals get away unscathed, because that's just how the cookie crumbles. C'est la vie. But boy, was I wrong. And I think it really comes down to the fact that we are currently living in a vastly different world to the one that was inhabited by Edward, the Duke of Windsor, in the early to mid 20th century. Because yes, while the news was a thing back then, it was carefully controlled, as it is today, the mainstream media, by the powers that be. And so whatever information is distilled to us as the public is information that has been approved. Whatever they don't want us to know about, we don't know about, except that is until the advent of social media. Now, rather than being the recipients of filtered news, we all have access and platforms to help spread it. With that, of course, comes pressure, dare I say unprecedented pressure sometimes, from the global public, not just your local constituents, but the world at large, pushing for the release of information, pushing for consequences. And perhaps this is the cynic in me. I'm not saying that I believe this to be completely true. I think that this pressure and this proliferation of information and calls for consequences is what pushed the police to not only investigate Andrew, but finally arrest him. Because arresting someone ain't easy. And we'll get into the legalities of that. But back in the day with Edward, there was a media blackout. People in the UK in particular were completely shielded from rumors of the affair. I mean, look, after reading Wallace's memoirs and many other books, they knew, because they would stare at her if they ever saw her. Sometimes they'd be parked outside her house, try to get a picture, etc., etc. So people knew. People are not stupid. We're definitely not nearly as stupid as the government and the powers that be like to think we are. But there was still a media blackout because they could do it. They could get away with it. And so it was far easier to keep the shenanigans, to put it lightly, of Edward and other royals under wraps without the harsh light of social media. Andrew was held for over 8 hours, I believe, and a few people have been annoyed at the fact that he was released, but just like how the police couldn't name him legally because he wasn't charged, the law in the UK dictates that you can't really hold someone for over 24 hours without applying for an extension. First from a superintendent and then from a magistrate. So you have to go to court. But over 8 hours in custody is nothing to sneeze at. He was likely put in a special custody suite because if you're held for over 6 hours, they're obligated to provide you with such a suite. From my understanding, it's basically almost like a jail cell. It's got a toilet, a bed, just the bare necessities. Nothing fancy for the former prince, of course. But just because he was released, I urge people not to discount the fact that he was arrested in the first place. I looked up the elements of misconduct in public office, and it is clear that by the time they decided to arrest Andrew, the investigation yielded quite a bit of evidence. So the offense of misconduct in public office is committed when a public officer acting as such willfully neglects to perform their duty and or willfully misconducts themselves to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder without reasonable excuse or justification. The punishment for this offense? Life imprisonment. So this tells us that by the time they decided to arrest Andrew, they were almost certain, if not certain, that the first three elements have been satisfied, or that they would be able to satisfy them in a court of law if this goes to trial. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Andrew may never see the inside of a courtroom. This may go nowhere. Again, the cynic in me thinks perhaps this was all for show, just to assuage the public's thirst for consequences. Look, we arrested him, and then they release him, and we're never to hear from him again. But the reason for his arrest is to satisfy that fourth element without reasonable excuse or justification. How are they to know without hearing his side of the story? Now, there have been cases, murder cases, where the suspect is not arrested and they voluntarily come to the police station because they're asked to give that information. Jodi Arias, the infamous butcher, was not under arrest when she voluntarily showed up, and then they basically ended up arresting her and charging her right then and there. And Chris Watts as well was not formally arrested to come in and provide the officers with information. So I don't know if that's because it's the States and things work differently there, but the fact that Andrew was arrested rather than being asked to come in willingly tells us that the police knew he is not willing to cooperate. He may be at flight risk, ex-royal or not. This man has resources available to him that the rest of us do not have access to. And so they decided, considering all the evidence they probably have, we've probably only seen the tip of the iceberg as the public, that they had enough to arrest him. What was also really telling is that, as per the reports, the royal family, the palace, didn't have a heads up. They were all taken aback and found out exactly the way we did, through a news report. And that tells me perhaps the police were worried that Andrew was going to be given that heads up as well, and he would flee. Speaking of the royal family, the king did release a statement claiming that he has learned with the deepest concern the news about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and suspicion of misconduct in public office. What now follows is the full, fair, and proper process by which this issue is investigated in the appropriate manner and by the appropriate authorities. In this, as I have said before, they have our full and wholehearted support and cooperation. Let me state clearly, the law must take its course. As this process continues, it would not be right for me to comment further on this matter. Meanwhile, my family and I will continue in our duty and service to you all. Charles R. This statement is very interesting depending on whether you believe the palace and the royal family members were completely in the dark or not. Specifically, I want to bring your attention to the beginning. I have learned with the deepest concern the news about Andrew and suspicion of misconduct in public office. To me, this reads as though King Charles learned about this pretty much around the same time that the rest of us did, just a couple of weeks ago, due to the Epstein data dump. And to make things clear, you all know I have affection for members of the royal family. I'm not here to sit and, implicate them in this because I don't know. All I can do is resort to information from people who did the hard yards, who did all the research, who tried to crack into the archives and to get all the information, and chief amongst them is historian and author Andrew Loney. But what's more important to me as well is common sense. And I'm not going to get too much into this in this episode because I believe we touched upon it last week in episode 148, where we talked about how Andrew's aides were involved in all of these shenanigans. He was constantly surrounded by security personnel. So the argument that this was done in the dark and absolutely no one knew becomes very difficult to swallow just based on these facts. The fact that he wasn't sneaking out in the dead of night using a private email where it wasn't even his name in the address and trying his best to go under the radar. We see none of that. He was confident and cocky enough to use his aides to perpetuate these alleged crimes. So based on that, it does become difficult to believe that King Charles has just now basically learned with the deepest concern the news about the alleged misconduct in public office. History tells us that the royal family, much like any other family, let's face it, at the end of the day, has a tendency to cover up for its members, whether it's out of love or out of a sense of survival. Because when one member, such as we're seeing now, steps out of line and brings disrepute to the entire family or institution, that puts that institution under risk. Its integrity is called into question, and to be quite honest, rightfully so. The second thing I want to point out in relation to this statement is that final paragraph, "We will continue in our duty and service to you all." It's interesting he says that because he then showed up for the very first time, as per my understanding, in the front row seats of London Fashion Week. And I was really taken aback by that as well. I think I let out a little laugh of disbelief because the optics were, I mean, look, who am I to know anything about PR or anything, but this is once again coming from the point of view of common sense, which, yes, I understand, my fourth grade teacher, you were correct, is not so common. But the optics were just off. I've heard other reporters talk about how he should have maybe gone to a charity, a little soup kitchen, a hospital, just anything but something as frivolous, I suppose, as Fashion Week. And yes, you can argue that London Fashion Week and just the British fashion industry in general is integral to the financial health, the economy of the United Kingdom. Yes, absolutely. No one's disputing that. But there is a time and place. That's all I'm saying. And I do wonder whether they just, scheduled that in last minute just to put the king out there and show that he's putting on a brave face and he's got nothing to hide and it's business as usual. Except it's not really business as usual because, as I mentioned, this isn't normal for King Charles. He doesn't normally attend these things. Queen Camilla later met with Anna Wintour. Whatever, I suppose that's more low-key because I believe Anna went to the palace rather than the king taking himself to the front rows of London Fashion Week. But I just wanted to point out that how interesting it was. It's like, we're going to continue to serve you. And here I am in Fashion Week. Let me know what you thought about that. So what now? We know Andrew has been released after around 8 to 10 hours. And while he was in custody, searches of his properties were conducted. And while he was there, of course, personal information was gathered from him. That was the whole purpose of the arrest, after all. After that, typically, I'm not saying this is what's happening in Andrew's case, but typically a person is given police bail and they're given a specific date to return to the police station for potential further questioning, because this was just preliminary. They've taken what he had to say, if he said anything. Don't know if he was being cooperative. Don't know if he refused to talk without his lawyer. That is generally good advice, by the way, just saying. Whether you're innocent or not, things can be used against you. And so they might have given up, let him go. But as I said, pending further investigation. Then, at some point, once further investigation is completed, and this may not be until weeks down the line, by the way, if not months, the Crown Prosecution, in concert with, of course, the Thames Valley Police in this instance, have to arrive at a decision. Now, interestingly, we all know that when a trial runs or a case is opened in the United Kingdom, it's either R versus blah, which it will be in this case, or insert name versus R, usually when it's on appeal. But that will be no different here. So it would basically be R versus Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and the R stands for Rex. In this instance, it used to be Regina in the era of the Queen, but now Rex for King Charles. Speaking of King Charles, I know we talked about the London Fashion Week situation. There have been calls for abdication. We know King Charles has been heckled over this more than once. And interestingly, there is now a pattern that no one can deny. Every time King Charles gets heckled, he does something. The first time being stripping Andrew of his titles, and this time, I don't know if the palace were involved, but basically stepping back and saying, you can do what you need to do with him. Yet again, this has backfired. He's always been seen as the weak king, and I am not here to talk about that because I don't know what is going on behind the scenes. It's the same thing with Meghan and Harry. I don't know whether he's, just being weak and letting his fatherly affections overshadow his sense of duty to his country or to the Commonwealth at large, or whether he is taking steps just quietly behind the scenes. Remember how Meghan and Harry were evicted basically from Frogmore Cottage 3 years ago in early 2023. That was under the reign of King Charles, not Queen Elizabeth. So there have been signs of at least some consequences when it comes to Meghan and Harry. Not necessarily what we would want as the public, especially British citizens, what you may think is befitting of their behavior. The concept of proportionality, the punishment must match the crime, and getting evicted from a home that they didn't even live in anymore doesn't seem enough for a lot of people, understandably so. But what this situation has now done, yet again, is reignite calls, at least from certain sectors, for King Charles to abdicate, because many people believe that Prince William is exactly the person who is needed at this moment. He has shown himself to be very proactive when it comes to dealing with Meghan and Harry, at least. We know that he really pushed for the entire bullying investigation, or at least putting a stop to it. He took it upon himself to personally talk to staff and ask them, with some of them breaking down at the mere mention of it. And he had talks with Jason Knopf. So he's clearly someone with principles and someone who wouldn't stand for this type of behavior, this type of corruption. William is the new monarchy, the modern monarchy. He is, I think, sufficiently far removed from the very archaic mindset, which, with all due respect to the late Queen, and now, of course, King Charles, to a lesser extent, King Charles, they grew up with. This whole notion of protecting the monarchy and sweeping things under the rug and keeping things hush-hush as long as they're done discreetly, they're okay. We'll talk about that a little later in the episode. There's a lot of evidence of the Queen really only putting her foot down, the late Queen, that is, when things went public. But I suppose the question is, are you pro the king abdicating, or would you like to see him on the throne, ride this out, maybe put it right himself, make things right himself? Parliament, for instance, right now, there is talk that they're looking at removing Andrew from the line of succession. Who's to know whether the king wasn't the one who instigated that? Perhaps he proposed it, or perhaps they asked him and he said yes. I think the line of succession in the UK is getting long enough as it is. I don't see how Andrew or even Eugenie, Beatrice are ever going to be on the throne. So if it comes to removing them from it, I don't see how that's going to affect the survival of the monarchy. Edward VIII and any potential heirs of his were, through an act of parliament, removed, banned from the line of succession, banned in the sense of his children, which he never had, but any prospective heirs, nope, not included. So it's not technically as groundbreaking as people are making it out to be, and that was a former king, let alone someone who was, what, now 8th in line? So I'm completely pro that. I'm completely pro Harry being removed from the line of succession. It is so strange to see the names of their children there, one of whom was born in the United States. So these are American citizens. They shouldn't even have titles, let alone be in the line of succession. So if King Charles is going to instigate that and set a precedent to these things happening, hey, if you mess up, and most importantly, if you're not contributing, if you're just cruising off your titles and not benefiting the monarchy in any way, you have no place in the line of succession. Perhaps if he did that, people might view him more favorably, and he may yet last, with the support of his people, a few more years on the throne. May he have a long life. I can't even imagine what this is doing to his health in terms of, if you want to see this from a very pro King Charles angle. He does have cancer. He's in his late 70s. The pressure of this, the stress of this cannot be good for him. So even from a place of concern, there is an argument to be had that maybe you should step down. You know, it's not your fault you had to wait till you were 70 to ascend the throne. But again, c'est la vie. Worse things have happened to many, many, many other people. Speaking of Meghan and Harry, of course, we had to hear through People magazine what their opinions are on what just happened. Meghan and Harry will never forego an opportunity to put their names in the headlines and to use a controversy or tragedy to do so. So People magazine, very shortly after Andrew's arrest, released an exclusive. Prince Harry was frustrated by comparisons to Andrew, whose arrest is embarrassing for the entire family. An insider says Harry has long resented comparisons to his uncle, as Andrew's arrest reverberates through the royal family. It was never fair to lump them together, an insider tells People. Harry served his country, did the job well, and never engaged in misconduct, yet lost security and housing, while Andrew was protected for years. This is the only paragraph I would like to highlight out of this article, because the rest is really not relevant to our discussion. First of all, I want to make it clear that I am in no way comparing what Andrew and Sarah Ferguson have done to what Meghan and Harry have done. They are operating in different spheres as far as we are aware. I know there's a lot of speculation about Meghan in particular before she met Harry, whether she knew Prince Andrew, whether she was a yacht girl, quote unquote, whether she was involved in the circle of Epstein. I personally don't believe she is. There is no evidence that she is. Yes, their names came up in some list associated with the Epstein files, but that was more of an appendix of sort, an index of sort, where any names that were mentioned were listed, including Elvis Presley, who died in the 70s. So clearly, the fact that their name was there doesn't implicate them in any way and is not proof that they ever came across the man. Now, with Meghan in particular, when Epstein was at his height of power in the 2000s, she was too old. She was too old, and I don't believe she operated in those circles. Meghan didn't really hit her stride until 2010, 2011, basically when she secured Suits. That's when she joined Soho House in 2012. And yes, Soho House has connections with Epstein, but by then, as I said, she was a woman in her early 30s, basically toast as far as Epstein is concerned. So without further evidence, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. My personal belief is based on the information available to me, and that it is Meghan and Harry have nothing to do with Epstein. You can tell me otherwise in the comments, point me to evidence indicating otherwise, and no, that list of names is not evidence, because otherwise Elvis Presley is implicated as well, somehow posthumously. Going back to this People magazine article, so he says, Harry served his country, did the job well, and never engaged in misconduct. First of all, let's just clear up the whole served his country thing. As far as the military is concerned, Harry was just given something to occupy him, because he was already proving to be a troublesome teenager and young man. And so the palace, much as they did with Andrew, and I'm going to get to this a little later, it's a whole separate segment, they wanted to keep him busy. And what better way to keep someone busy and out of trouble than to stick them in the military? Harry had no business being in Sandhurst. I have talked about this before as someone who trained in one of the most elite officer training institutions in the world, in Australia. I know what it takes to get into these things. They are highly competitive. And Harry, with a bunch of D's for his O-levels or A-levels, that would never have cut it had he not been Prince Harry. Just like Eton. He had no business being accepted into Eton. Is that how you say it? Eton. And the only reason he was there, as everyone knows, is because he was Prince Harry, Prince William's brother. In the same vein, he barely lasted through Sandhurst. He was passed. He was basically just helped along. And once he graduated, they were bending over backwards to make him happy, to give him assignments he wanted. That's the problem with how these institutions, as much as people like to think, the separation of powers and the military is entirely separate and the police are separate and there's no way they're swayed by the royal family. Of course they're swayed. Of course they have a sense of duty and obligation. And if you believe certain sources such as Andrew Loney, they can also get threatened if they don't do the royal family's bidding. Whether that's true or not is unknown to me, but it makes sense. Then we get to never engaged in misconduct, yet lost security and housing. I don't understand what Harry's definition of misconduct is. I would say the bullying allegations themselves, which yes, they continue to deny to this very day, are enough to qualify as misconduct. Driving people to tears, making them quit, giving them PTSD. What Meghan wants, Meghan gets. That's all misconduct. Jason Knopf and his emails, that was all used as evidence against Meghan in court. But then, of course, we have the rest of it. Megxit, the Oprah interview, the Netflix series, which they were evicted from Frogmore after that Netflix series debuted in December of 2022. So as the way I see it, it's no coincidence. Not to mention, I think it was right after the release of Spare, where he revealed private information, such as the internal layouts of the palace, the schedules of certain members of the royal family, what they like to do, where they like to go do it. That's all violating the Privacy and, dare I say, if someone really wants to push it, the Official Secrets Act, which I don't even think members of the royal family are bound by because it exists to protect their interests after all. And then, of course, there's the very small, little tiny detail that Harry very conveniently leaves out, or, his source here. You quit. And when you quit, you lose privileges. Andrew never quit. He was fired. He was fired. And so until he was fired, he enjoyed the perks rather, of being a member of the royal family. I personally disagree with that. I don't believe he should have had security. I mean, if Princess Anne, his sister, the hardest working royal, doesn't have 24/7 security and really only gets them on her engagements, then surely Andrew had no business having security either. I understand his daughters were stripped of it 15 years ago now, I think, 2011 or so, and he was not happy about that. But there are things that I think should have been removed. So I suppose there is an argument that Harry is calling out some type of a double standard here, especially if you consider the possibility, the oh so real possibility of the palace knowing what he and Sarah were getting up to. Finally, I have a very brief update, if anyone's even still sticking around at this point, on Marius Borg Høiby. Last week, we talked about how I thought he was going for some kind of a mitigation strategy, not a defense strategy per se, because it's not a defense to say, I was drunk, I was blacked out, and I didn't know what I was doing if you voluntarily, you self-intoxicated. But it may come into play when it comes to sentencing. It might mitigate the harshness of the sentence. It might lead to a more lenient one. Fast forward a week later, and it looks like his entire strategy is already crumbling. He is crumbling under pressure. He's another spoiled brat who was never made to face the consequences of his actions until recently, until they couldn't get away from them. They caught up to him. So on the 11th day of the trial last week, the fourth alleged victim testified. And it was the same story. They started off with consensual sex, but they were drunk. Perhaps drugs were involved. They definitely were involved when it came to Marius. So perhaps the women partook, whatever. I'm not placing blame on the women, by the way, of course not. For whatever reason, they fell unconscious. They fell asleep. Then this particular woman came to because she felt pain when Marius was having his way with her and filming it. That's how this all went to court after all. He captured his own evidence. He was, his own demise. Now, normally he would either deny doing this or he would say, I don't remember. I wasn't, in charge of my faculties. I myself was deeply intoxicated. I blacked out. However, the pressure and the gravity of the situation seems to finally catch up to him, because this time, during his testimony, he admitted that he did not ask the alleged victim for consent before taking the photos and videos. She went along with it, he said, explaining why he did it anyway. There was no, I don't want to. Now remember, these women were sleeping and barely coming to. We all know what it's like when you're in a haze. Even if you're technically half awake, you don't know what's going on. In fact, they got in an expert to testify that it's very normal for when you're in that in-between stage to still not know what's going on. You might think you're dreaming. You might think you're hallucinating. Specifically, the expert stated, in this state, it takes a while to process what's happening. She may not have been able to resist the actions due to sleep or sleep drunkenness. There was also no agreement that høiby could have sex with the alleged victim while she was asleep. So he never asked for consent. The best he has is, well, she didn't say no while she was asleep. I'm not saying he's faking these tears, by the way, and the sobbing. I think the gravity, as I said, of what's happening is finally dawning on him, and that he could really go away for a long time for this. And mommy dearest herself and her own scandals now with Epstein will not be there to save him. And that's it. That's all I have for you today. It was quite a lengthy episode, especially for those of you on Patreon with the bonus segment. I will be clipping it and putting that up on YouTube later on in the week. So do stay tuned for that. We cover the many similarities of both Sarah and Andrew and Meghan and Harry, but also, more importantly, the point of that segment is to show how difficult it is really to believe that the palace just didn't know what was going on. And it also explains why there is so much tolerance for Meghan and Harry's shenanigans. Thank you so much for joining me today, and take care. Have a great week ahead of you. I'll see you next time.